supply-side options. Firstly, looking at soft supply-side options. And one of the best examples of that is the Working for Water program in South Africa. The Working for Water program aims to overcome a problem that we have with catchments that are infested with alien vegetation. These alien species were imported from outside of South Africa, from Australia, from North America, and from Europe, and even East Asia, and they outcompete the natural vegetation and take over the catchments. So in a heavily infested catchment, you'll see what looks like forestry, but it's actually just an alien species that's totally outcompeted all the other species in the catchment. One of the consequences of these aliens is that they typically use more water than the natural vegetation and therefore reduce river flows. They also obviously reduce biodiversity. If you compare a biodiverse natural catchment to one where it's just a single species that's taken over the whole hill slope. So what the Working for Water program aims to do is train and employ low-skilled workers to clear these landscapes of the alien vegetation. And then once the landscapes have been cleared, they go through a restoration process so that you can get as close to the natural vegetation as possible. The restoration can occur through sort of slow natural processes where you get migration of the natural species in from adjacent areas, or through an accelerated process where seedlings are generated, produced and planted in the catchment to make the restoration happen much faster. The invasiveness is in a catchment. Removing the invasives can increase river flows by up to 15%. So this is clearly a very strong supply-side adaptation option in infested catchments. The alien clearing program also has co-benefits, and the most direct of those are through employment of the people who are trained to do the clearing. Also in the value chain of economic value chain of the cleared vegetation, which can be turned into charcoal, be used for firewood, and even for something called biochar, which is burnt wood that stores carbon dioxide and is then buried in the soils to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So the Working for Water program, the catchment restoration process, has wider biodiversity benefits as well. A great example of this is how restoration of the catchment increases the number and the diversity of insect pollinators in the area, which then feeds through into economic benefits on adjacent farms, where these pollinators increase the productivity of the farms through better pollination of the crops that are growing there, whether it's fruit or vegetables or other crops. So a great example of landscape restoration actually comes from India. There's an organization there called the Water Organization Trust, which has been working with rural communities all over India, but particularly in Maharashtra since 1993. What they've been doing there is helping farmers overcome an emerging problem, which was more frequent water shortages that they were experiencing in the dry season, both in terms of groundwater, but also dry season river flows. So the Watershed Organization Trust worked with farmers to restore the upland catchment areas where the rainfall comes in and then feeds through into the groundwater and river systems further down. They instigated a revegetation program where they planted trees and planted grass to restore the landscape, which then slows down the flow of water and helps the infiltration into the soils and then into the groundwater system. That enhances recharge, as we call it, the recharge of the groundwater systems. And then they also instigated some landscape modification, essentially building some artificial channels that help capture and retain the water in ponds that then enhance that groundwater recharge as well. Another example of soft adaptation is floodplain management. So in many river floodplains, the sort of historical way to deal with flood risk was a hard approach, or flood protection. The whole aim was to move water very rapidly downstream, often in a concrete canal, out of the area that you're trying to protect, and then protecting that area, but at the same time avoiding or shortcutting the natural system. So a natural system in the floodplain, when a flood happens, you'd get inundation over the flat areas as the water flows over the riverbank. And that then feeds water into the shallow groundwater system, making water available for later in the year. That floodplain inundation also helps with farming in the unflooded periods because it supplies extra nutrients to the soils through the sediment that's contained in the floodwater. So allowing inundation to happen rather than protecting against it can actually enhance groundwater recharge and increase the groundwater resource availability in the dry season. This kind of practice was a traditional practice in many large European rivers, went out of fashion through protection and is now being reinstated. So for instance, in the Rhine River down in the Netherlands, large parts of the floodplains are kept as what we call flood meadows. So these are grasslands that have water-tolerant grasses in them. They're used for grazing for livestock in the dry season, but when the seasonal flood comes down, then the cattle and other livestock are moved into higher ground, and the flood meadow can be used to attenuate the flood and recharge groundwater systems. Now, in some instances, this sort of living with flooding is not always feasible, and hard protection is needed. So, for instance, the City of London is in a floodplain, and some kind of protection needs to happen there to protect all the property that's available. But there are also good examples of coexistence rather than competition with flooding. An interesting example comes from Bangladesh, which is a country where about 80% of the population are subject to seasonal flooding as the major rivers that flow out of the Himalaya, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, come into their delta area in the Bay of Bengal. So what local villagers do is they have higher elevation areas which they use for refuge in the flood season, and then the farmlands are seasonally flooded. But what they're doing to adapt is developing what are called floating farms. Now, a floating farm is just what it says. You could have a chicken coop or a vegetable garden or even a fish pond that actually floats on a pontoon. And so as the land gets flooded, they rise up with the floodwaters, and you can continue to produce food for your family and for selling on the market. There are also some really innovative ideas. One of them is floating schools. So this is a boat that's been converted to be a school, and when the floodwaters rise, the boat first acts as a school bus, so it goes from sort of high elevation refuge to refuge, picks up all the school kids, and then they all sit in the boat and actually have their school lessons there. This floating school has solar-powered computers and internet access, and the school lessons continue throughout the flood season, whereas previously the kids would have been isolated and not be able to get to school.